Hello, memoir and writers. I am Grant Faulkner at Memoir Nation, and I'm happy to say that Pro Writing Aid is now sponsoring this podcast. And I'm happy about that because I have used Pro Writing Aid, both as a grammar checker, but more importantly, as a tool to help me structure and probe questions in my book. And the main tool I have used is their manuscript analysis tool. It provides full manuscript developmental feedback in minutes. And to tell you the truth, I was initially dubious of it, but when I used it, it helped me uncover plot holes and think about different structural possibilities and see how my pacing worked. And I liked it because it was kind of like a beta reader because it opened up questions for me to consider. But I want to emphasize not solutions, just questions. And it made me more aware of some story elements to consider. So I essentially emerged from that analysis with a revision plan in hand. Just so you know, Pro Writing Aid's goal is not to automate storytelling. It's to make the process of writing richer and more empowering by opening up questions to consider your writing. Also, many of Pro Writing Aid's competitors support only one part of the writing process, but Pro Writing Aid has tools to help writers, from the first spark of inspiration to the polished draft. And it really is focused on creative writing, not business writing and stuff like that. So here's the dramatic ending. We have an exclusive discount for you. If you type in memoir, all caps memoir, to the promo code box on the purchase page, you'll get 20% off all annual subscription plans. So I encourage you to type in memoir when you sign up for Pro Writing Aid and get 20% off, and write and revise, write and revise, write and revise. Thank you, Memoir Nation listeners.
Hello, performers. Hello, exhibitionists. Hello, let it all hang outists. Yes, that is a noun. Welcome to another episode of Memoir Nation. I'm Brooke Warner here with Grant Faulkner. And Grant, I think it's possible that we're going to push up against the boundaries of a little bit of discomfort or embarrassment today. Maybe not. We'll see. But it is time, and we have the right guest to talk about sex and sex writing and writing about sex. And Courtney Kocak has really made it her life's work to destigmatize these kinds of conversations. So she's a fun guest for us today, and I am just going to go for it. Okay, so first things first. Are you uncomfortable talking about sex and or sex writing?
Wow. You put me on the spot.
Or no,
here.
I'm sorry, writing about sex is what I meant to say. Are you uncomfortable writing about sex?
Brooke, I think I need to remind you of one thing. I'm Midwesterner. And beyond that, I'm an Iowan. And there's a phrase in Iowa, Iowa nice, which translates as don't you dare talk about sex. So I might be genetically uncomfortable, by nature. That said, I have thought a lot about writing about sex, and I actually have a fair number of sex scenes in my stories, and readers have told me I write about sex well. So I'll go for some frank sex conversation today in front of our 20,000 listeners, which is twice as big as my hometown in Iowa. So this is risky territory.
Sex episodes get more listeners, like by their very definition. Sells. Yes, absolutely. So yeah, historically it's interesting because I've been very open about sex and being involved in like sex books and sex publishing, but I found it like definitely confronting it on a new level when it comes to putting into my own writing. Like when I was at Seal Press, I worked on so many sex books, like books about sex, about porn and kink and sex toys and memoirs that talked about sex and books about sexual identity. And I think for that reason, I also relate a lot to Courtney, and her book is Girl Gone Wild. And she's really writing a feminist coming of age story. Like she's a feminist. A lot of her formation of her identity comes through challenging sexual experiences. And I actually think that's quite common for young women who end up having a lot of I should say like young women who have a lot of confidence will sometimes find themselves in these compromising sexual situations because they put themselves out there, and then they're sort of like finding their own feminism and figuring out their own identity. And, we come of age, confident women, I will say, come of age feeling like we're in charge. And so then we'll like put ourselves out into the world only to discover that, in fact, it's super misogynistic. And no matter how much control you think you have, the patriarchy is very real and it is hard to have true power as a woman. And so I guess you can't really talk about sex or write about sex without talking or writing about power. And so I think, when it comes to my own writing, like I am grappling with how much to write about sex, how much I should include like knowing that no matter what I include, I'm going to feel overexposed. But reading Courtney's book was actually very liberating for me, because there is this way that if you're like reading what other people are doing, I think sometimes you feel I could do that too. Which is really what led me to decide that I wanted to talk about this today, because I do think that sex writing is a really important thing to talk about for writers. And it's simultaneously like very difficult to actually do that kind of writing. So here we are. We're doing it.
Here we are. Yeah, I should make the distinction that the sex I've written about exists in the fictional realm. So I haven't really truly written about my own sex life. And I'm actually not even sure that I really want to, maybe someday, who knows. But I'm definitely intrigued by sexual dynamics, and I love that we can have, sexual conversations now in ways that were definitely impossible for a good part of my lifetime. And part of that openness to talking about sex is actually living here in the Bay Area, because sex is just very much on Bay Area people's minds, I guess, or we have a historical kind of rootedness in the subject. So yeah, I think of sexual dynamics a lot. And I remember, I feel like I've gone through so many eras of sexual conversations. Like I remember when I first encountered the phrase date rape, which didn't exist before I was in college, So, that concept just wasn't part of sexual discourse or acknowledged in any way. So it was a strange and startling concept. But the irony is that was only the beginning of a conversation that was 40 years ago, and we're still having that conversation essentially. So we've come a long way, but we've got a long way to go, obviously. But I want to circle back to these many books you've worked on over the years, Brooke, that centered sex in some way, because it sounds like it was easy for you to work on these kinds of books. But then when it comes to writing your own scenes on this, it's not. And I get it, of course, because it's not your own work, but you've told me you were Seal Press's sex editor. And so did you ever feel any way about that? You opened the show by talking about performing and exhibitionism. So does this extend into working on books about sex?
I think I have to say, no, it does not. Like, I think that's the thing. Like, I've never wanted to, do sex work, or like Courtney has an OnlyFans page, like that is so far from anything that I would do or feel comfortable doing. But I, like you, am really curious about the human experience. And you said sexual dynamics. Obviously, sex is a human experience that basically all of us have, unless you're an incel, and sex is connection, self-expression. And it's also complex, because of how intimate it is, and like, here's where the power stuff comes in, obviously. Like, I don't think that men and women experience sex the same way. That's a blanket statement, but obviously, like, our bodies are different. And so I think, most women know what it feels like to be objectified. Most women have had negative sexual encounters and experiences, and caveat, of course, some men have too. But, women are raised to be careful and oftentimes fearful of sex. And so a hallmark of feminism, and this was like really what opened my eyes at Seal, was that we should be able to enjoy sex and take charge of our sex lives, not be apologetic, not tolerate being objectified. So there's the feminism, right? Like, it's the fact that we deal with sex like being in the room in almost everything that we do, especially when we're young, right? Like, who's looking at us, coming on to us, being inappropriate with us, wanting to have sex with us. And so there's all these interactions. And I therefore think that memoir is this very obvious place for our thoughts and experiences to be cataloged. I will say this, Grant, like working on all those books over the years, that I have never, ever like read something that I was working on and felt judgmental, So when I'm saying like, oh, I'm going to be overexposed, it's interesting because I don't feel that way as a reader. Like, I always think that they're brave, and I've read everything from like the sex positive stuff to the abuse narratives, right? That's the continuum of sexuality. And so when writers dare to share their experiences on the page, I always feel like there isn't anything more intimate than that. You're allowing people to see you, all of you. And so I've just learned a lot over the years, and I do feel better for it, and I've seen both extremes of what sex looks like when it's empowered, and then of course how it's used as one of the worst forms of abuse. And we get to experience that, through this form, through memoir.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was just thinking while you were talking about how just deeply rooted that taboo of talking about sex is, whether you grew up in a small town in the Midwest or in the Bay Area, even. The spectrum is just really striking. And from self-expression and connection, I'm glad you used those words, all the way to objectification and abuse. And I have to say that, I haven't experienced the latter two, but I've talked to a lot of women about dealing with sex in the room, as you put it perfectly. And men and women do lead strikingly different lives in this regard. And I don't think most men are even exactly attuned to how they can create that sex in the room atmosphere and how that can be a threat or feel like a threat. And I thought it'd be interesting to talk a moment about some of the books we've read by guests on this podcast that center sex in some way, just to show the range of what we're talking about. And two writers who come to mind for me that show a more empowered way of talking about sex are Carvel Wallace and Lydia Yuknavitch. And in Another Word for Love, Carvel, he does write about abuse, of course. So I should say that it's nuanced, but he also writes about, being sexually experimental and about his own desires and encounters in ways that serve this theme of love, because love in his book is love in all of its permutations. That's why I love it. And then Lydia Yuknavitch in The Chronology of Water writes sex so explicitly and so openly. It's a release, it's grief, it's in keeping with her form of embodied writing, another phrase that I love that she teaches and exemplifies. And it's just visceral and carnal and definitely it will stay with you.
Yeah, those are great examples. And I wanted to talk about Amanda Knox, because I just felt that she was so brave exploring herself sexually through talking about writing about masturbation, which is another taboo topic, not always easy to talk about, right? And, that she in that book is trying to reclaim her sense of sexual identity after having been made out to be a monster by the Italian media for a crime of passion that she didn't commit. And so that's a good scene to read if you want to see how that's done. Liz Gilbert, of course, writes about masturbation in Eat, Pray, Love. The first time I read it, I was very uncomfortable. I was like, okay. But then the second time I read it, I was like, I don't know, like it changed, it morphed for me over time. And I'm very glad that there's a masturbation scene actually in that book. Gina Frangello in Blow Your House Down writes like Lydia Yuknavitch, explicitly about sex, even about kink, about the kind of sex that she always longed to have, and how she got to have that kind of sexual connection with the man that she was having an affair with. And Gina is a great example, because she wanted to show that midlife sex is sexy sex, is good sex, talk about being naked on the page, and then being like, look at this, like, this is okay, this is normal, this is good. And I think that women need that kind of role modeling desperately. So, again, just to show that range of positivity too, that there's all these spaces that we can explore.
Yeah, I can see that absolutely. But then we need to recognize the other side of the spectrum book, those books that talk about sexual encounters that are abuse, that are disempowering, that are outright assault. And that's hard too, but also admirable. And I'm thinking about Sue Williams-Silverman, who just taught for us at Memoir Nation, and her incredible first memoir, Because I Remember Terror, Father, I Remember You. The title tells it all, I think. We recently had on Karen Palmer in She's Under There, who has some, coercive scenes and some power dynamic scenes that are about control and fear and the threat of abuse. And of course, we talked to the wonderful and lively E. Jean Carroll about her experience of sexual assault from none other than our president, Donald Trump. And the reality is that, these books are so prevalent because these experiences are so prevalent. And I remember in the early days of Me Too, how many women were posting about their experiences on social media, so many of my friends. And, I think it just felt like literally all of my close friends had been harassed in some ways, and the stories just kept rolling in. But I know we both believe that these books do change the culture, even if we happen to be in a moment of, kind of slide back and backlash right now.
Yeah, I heard someone on another podcast say recently that in 30 years, we're going to look back at this moment with horror, just at how much we abdicated and how morally low we descended as a culture. And there will come a point when we know much, much more about the Epstein files, after Trump is dead, and we're going to have this reckoning about what it means to have a rapist, pedophile president. That time will come. I know it will. It's just a hard moment right now because we're really grappling with these people in power essentially getting away with abuse. It is insane. But Grant, this is what's interesting, right, about sex, for all the ways that we as humans love to revel in and enjoy sex, others are using it to hurt people and assert dominance. And so I think this is the range that Courtney is actually addressing in her memoir. And one of the reasons I really like it, because, this Girls Gone Wild title is because she worked for Girls Gone Wild, the enterprise that was famous in the late 90s and early 2000s. It was also super exploitative. The founder, Joe Francis, was accused of a lot of things where it came to taking advantage of young women. He was accused of assault. And so, Courtney's book is this young woman throwing herself into the world full force, taking everything that comes your way, the good and the bad. And when you do that, you really are living full throttle, and you don't get to do that without avoiding the role that sex plays in your life, and especially when you're young and beautiful. So it's a complicated journey, a complicated ride of a book. And there are a lot of bad decisions that Courtney tackles head on. And also this no nonsense candor and clear-eyed compassion for her younger self. So it kind of does all of that stuff, which I think is really great. Great subject matter. So thank you, Courtney, for that. Thanks, Grant, for playing along. And, without further ado, but also after a palate cleansing break, we are going to bring you Courtney Kocak. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone. We have Courtney Kocak on the show with us today. Courtney is a writer, podcaster, and comedian based in Los Angeles. She originally hails from a rural farming community in Minnesota, home to more cows than people. As a writer, Courtney has written for Amazon's animated series Danger and Eggs and Netflix's Know It All. And she has also written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, Cosmo, Slate, Huffington Post, and many others. She has three podcasts. And I was very honored recently to be a guest on The Bleeders. And all of your podcasts are awesome, Courtney. That one is focused on writing and publishing. And then you have two others, Private Parts Unknown, about love and sexuality around the world, and Podcast Bestie, a best friend to podcasters trying to grow and monetize their shows. Courtney reports on gender, sexuality, psychedelics, reproductive rights, sex work, and sustainability, all amazing topics, most of which you cover in your new memoir recently out, and that is called Girl Gone Wild. Welcome, Courtney.
Thank you so much for having me. I am, zooming in from Austin right now. So
okay, so neither Los Angeles nor rural Minnesota. So you must be on book tour.
I'm on book tour, and my husband's actually starting a business. But anyway,
awesome. Okay, well, let's start with Girl Gone Wild, obviously. So titled because you worked for the Girls Gone Wild enterprise for a little while, which was wildly popular and also horribly or I should say famously horrible is what I wanted to say. In the late 90s and early 2000s, it was basically video compilations featuring young women filmed in various states of undress, acting provocatively. And later in the book, you talk about your experience there as both a betrayal to yourself, but also something you were grateful for. And I think that's a really good jumping off point for you to talk about what your book is. And then, of course, why that title piece is called Girl Gone Wild.
Yeah, I quickly realized that, I was working on these pieces and collecting these essays that I had been writing. And I was like, what is the common theme here? What's the spine? And I realized it's an unwitting feminist coming of age is what I call it, because it was all these experiences that taught me what society thinks about women. And that was kind of a centerpiece experience that really scrambled my brain and kind of set me on a new course. I don't know if I would be a writer if I hadn't sold t-shirts on the Girls Gone Wild tour. There were early experiences where it was I acted in independent films, and every time I got a job, they wanted me to take my clothes off, which I'm not opposed to taking my clothes off, but do we have to do it every time? And sexual assault, then, selling t-shirts on the Girls Gone Wild tour, then abortion. And it was all these experiences. And by the end of it, I was like, I don't want to pretend to be someone else. I want to figure out like what it means to be a young woman, because like, this is not what I expected. And so I'm grateful for these kind of mistakes I made or bad experiences I had. I'm not responsible for all of them, but I was strong enough to get through them. And I'm so happy that I can report from the other side. And like, writing this book was writing my way out of the shame of all these experiences. And it was really like a love letter to my younger self. And anyway, I hope it is a gift to younger women that, might be ashamed that they've gone down these various paths.
That's so interesting. And there are so many different things in the book, and it spans, from the age of when you're 6 up until you're 40. And it's a very nonlinear book and fairly episodic. And sometimes there are essays, but they're stitched together in this, as you said, like you kind of found the theme or the spine of the story as you wrote it. And I love that phrase you just said. What was it? An unwitting feminist?
Unwitting feminist coming of age. Yep.
Yeah. I'm kind of always fascinated by the unwitting or the accidental in life and creation. So I was wondering, can you talk about it just that scope and how you chose to structure it the way you did?
Yeah, I had maybe even more scrambled. Like, it's mostly chronological, but I think of it as like a dirty chronological, especially as I get older. I feel like the older that you get, the more reason you have to call back to previous experiences. So I feel like, especially in like the second and third act, it's a little messier in that way. I had it more scrambled in the first full draft that I did. And I got a feedback letter I think it was from Hannah Howard. And she was like, I think chronological unless you have a reason to do otherwise. And I thought that was good guidance. So I kind of restructured accordingly. And yes, I did things that I like as a reader. I like some short little snackable chapters. I like them sprinkled in too, so where I don't know where I'm going to find them. And I sort of did that. I think of them as crepes, like they're individually snackable, but collectively filling. I wanted to write something really propulsive, which is something that I enjoy as a reader. And I get into this abusive relationship, and I really wanted to write how that experience felt, but I didn't want it to sag too much or like really feel like it was a sad time in my life, but I didn't want the reader to get stuck there and not want to keep going. So that was something that I thought about when I was writing. And then, I really, in the third act, just, I'm very happy, like despite these things that have happened. So I really did want to sort of animate the growth and that part of the journey as well.
You do a good job of something that's not a totally easy balance, because it's like it's a hard memoir in a lot of ways with a lot of really tough experiences in it, but your tone is upbeat, so like you find this really, really good balance. Like I never felt sad or sorry for you, but the whole time I was like, okay, she's tackling tough stuff and we're still in a good headspace here for the most part. And it was interesting for me as I read, because I was like, what is this book? What is this book about? And I was like finding my way through it. And when I teach memoir, I do talk about aboutness, as a way to keep writers focused and not straying too far into tangents. And so that earlier passage that I referenced, I actually wanted to read a little bit more of it, because toward the end of the book, I mean, this is maybe like 3/4 of the way through, you write that that basically the Girls Gone Wild experience was something that resulted in you evolving in opposition to everything it stood for. And I love this line because you say, not a prudish opposition, but a full-throated sex positive opposition. And then you write about what you're doing in your podcast, and you say it's about destigmatizing conversations about sex, interrogating the patriarchy, and empowering people, especially women, to own their desires and take charge of their pleasure. Right there, I was like, oh, there's the aboutism of this book, and maybe also the or aboutness, either or aboutness of Courtney too. And so I was wondering if you could talk about how you found your way to writing this purpose and passion. Like you're doing it in your whole life, it sounds like, not just in this book.
Yeah, it has been interesting to think about like how I do a lot of seemingly disparate things and how they are all actually very connected. And I do think having some of the conversations that so like abortion, it was something I could not even say out loud for 2 years. And I thought I was going to take to the grave. I thought I would literally never tell anybody just because I knew how my parents felt about it, because of the religion, because of the small town kind of conservativeness of it. And then, rights started, not they weren't taken away yet, but it was like clear that was on the horizon. And I was like so hungry for any woman's account that I would read. I was like, oh, thank you. And then I was like, why am I not saying, why can I be privately feminist and I can't be public in this way? And, I'd already started the Private Parts Unknown was actually a show called Reality Bites that I started back in 2016. And I had been doing this show for a couple years, and I was like, I have the sex podcast and I'm never admitted on my podcast that I've had an abortion. Like this, I have to rectify this. And so I started interviewing people for the show, Liz Winstead, some other people that I admire in the space, and could finally talk about my own experience on there. Around the same time, I wrote about my abortion for Hello Giggles. But it was like those two things were happening kind of at the same time. I was working on those podcast interviews. I was getting the essay out there. And like, it's interesting that they were both kind of happening in tandem, and then just continuing to have all those conversations over the years. Like as I realized what my oversights were, I would correct them and then have people on where I could have those conversations, talk about my own experience, hear about other people's experiences. And I think what I tried to do in the book, it's not like perfect math, but I thought of them as like some of the essays as A sides and B sides of kind of the same topic, or, like sixth period math is about an early experience being ashamed of masturbation in admittedly a forum I should not have been doing it. But then there's a later, I come all over my closet floor, which is like funny, and me going to shop for my first vibrator as like a single lady and like finding, less shame around this topic. And so I tried to do that with various essays in the book where I felt like you could see the growth in me through these two different tellings at different times in my life.
That's super interesting. And Courtney, before you came on, Brooke and I were talking about how sex isn't an easy topic to write about. And since you came from a small town in the Midwest, I came from a small town in the Midwest. And I think it's especially hard to write about in that context. And a lot of people, as a result, totally gloss over it, or they're just really uncomfortable including it in their memoirs, or worried what other people will think. And so you obviously grappled with this, and it's very visible in regard to your work and on the page. So what advice do you have for people who want to write more openly about sex but feel embarrassed?
I mean, I would just say like one of my main like guiding truths of memoir and writing this book was to write into my shame. And I did that around a lot of things. And sex was another thing that I didn't necessarily have my own shame about it, but there was all kinds of cultural messaging that maybe I had to write through. And writing into all of those, anything I like, it's such a signal that I now pay attention to when there's something I'm resistant to writing about. That's like exactly what I should be writing about. And then allowing yourself the time and space to like properly iterate on the topic. 'Cause like, you're not going to get it all out in the 3D dimensionality that it deserves the very first time. It's like some of those essays, like I would write and then come back to sometimes even like a year or more later. And like I would have more perspective on it. Also, I might have more distance where I could kind of like fill in the gaps. And it's so interesting. I think a student recently was asking me about this, and I really had to stop and think. But I think, for the first level for me, and all of these essays kind of happened on their own timeline, but like the first level is like figuring out the events and getting those on the page. And then making meaning out of those events is like maybe the second level. And then the next level, which I didn't really think of before I was really deep in revisions on this book, but like the embodiment of that, which adds like a whole nother layer of meaning when you're saying how you did the action and like integrating the meaning and the event together. I found a lot, especially like with sex and stuff, like I found a lot of what it meant in me, like really sitting with like, how did I do that? Or like, what was I saying? Well, like, what was the response there? And like really like getting into the nitty gritty of those scenes, and also forgiving myself for not having a tape recorder.
Right.
And like, I think when you're early writing memoir, you think like, I need all this journalistic truth. And I have found like the most honest was when I was just like, it definitely happened like this one time. And so it can happen like this here. Or, you know what I mean? Giving myself a little bit of space to like recreate and not be beholden to like what exactly was in that moment, because no one can know, I know it's not necessarily sex specific, but that kind of framework helped me tap into finding those moments as honestly as I could.
Thanks for that so much, Courtney, because we covered that question in all kinds of iterations in interviews, because memoir is this very fraught thing where nobody remembers everything and everybody has feelings about not remembering, and so then you're like, how do you work your way through that? And how do you give yourself permission? And as you said, breathing room. So that was just really wonderfully articulated. We love it. I want to talk a little bit about your chapter titles, because you really do have some of the greatest chapter titles ever. I guess you're saying it's sort of essayistic, but you do a great job weaving them into a cohesive narrative. So we'll call them chapter titles. But there's a chapter called How to Set Your Own Trap, and then it unfolds in 12 steps. The last one being step 12, break free for real this time, you stupid bitch. And the reason that I wanted to bring that up is because you're not easy on yourself in this memoir, which frankly makes you very relatable and very likable. You're real. And even as you're doing a lot of compromising stuff, you're never a victim. And so you're just talking about this, like digging deeper in your memoir to expose things about yourself that are maybe not your best moments. And I guess I was wondering if there's anything that you ended up putting in print, and you just said this about your abortion, so maybe that's it, but you could get more into it or say something different, like something that you ended up putting in that you debated not putting in, like that didn't make the cut, but then did.
Yeah, I really didn't do that for myself, because I have, at least for my own work, I really think like the things that I'm scared to write about are exactly what I should be writing about. And so I did wind up trimming things about other people. I didn't censor myself that much in the first draft. I just like wrote. I wrote with real names. I wrote, warts and all. And I kept my warts. But, friends and ex-lovers, sometimes I would write something that it's not like it wasn't related to what was happening. It was. I won't cite examples because I cut them intentionally, but, just things where I said a little too much about the other person's story. And so I really tried to be strict with myself about like, is this my story to tell? And even if it was funny, or even if I did think it gave a little bit more context about someone else, I trimmed it in the final accounting because I wanted to, even people that I'm not super close with, like I wanted to honor those relationships. And I think I did a good job because I sent pages out to, like, I did a legal read, and then I also did like a ethical read for myself. And I sent things out to, like I gave my best childhood friend a chance to read pages that were related to her and ask her if she wanted to keep her name or not. And like I had to reach out to an ex because I wanted to keep this text like exactly as he wrote it. And I sort of needed his permission to do that. And both of them were like very flattered. And I reached out to some other people too, but they were like flattered by their depictions, even though not everything I said about them was perfect. But I think the things that are sensitive to the people in your life. And like, I did like one of my exes, I said he pissed the bed when he was drunk and he was terrible when he broke up with me and blah, blah, blah. But I didn't say the thing that I knew that he was the most sensitive about. And it ultimately didn't really matter in the story. Nobody knows it's missing except me and him and, any of our closest friends. And so hearing feedback from those people that they were happy with how they were depicted made me feel like, okay, I did a good job.
Yeah. I like that ethical reading after the legal reading. That's really, really honorable. And you published this book on Trio House Press, and anytime one of our guests publishes with a smaller indie, we like to ask about the experience, but, and how you landed there. But we also just want to celebrate indie presses. I actually generally publish with indie presses myself. So tell us the story of your publication.
Yeah. Well, I think indies are doing, especially when it comes to memoir, like some of the most interesting work out there. And I knew that, I took a couple incubators with Chloe Caldwell, and she's done such an awesome job of like her first books, charting her own course and doing it with indies. But, in like 2020, if you would have asked me like where I want to publish, I would have said like Big Five or bust. And ultimately, I did get a fancy agent for a little bit, and it was a disappointing experience. We took out another project. We did one round. It went to an acquisitions board and then died. And I was like, okay, but there's still a lot, there's more juice to squeeze here. And this person did not agree and was not interested in representing my memoir, literally because I'm not a famous person. And I was like, okay. So we went our separate ways. And I actually think that was such a gift it was disappointing at the time because I was like, this is going to change my life. And like, it wound up not going. But I got to really like sit with what my values are and what I really wanted out of the experience. And like, this is like some of my biggest heart work that I will probably ever do. I hope to write mini books, but like, this is my coming of age story. And like, I didn't want to lose control. I've written a pilot related to the Girls Gone Wild story. I wanted to produce the audiobook. I didn't want somebody to tell me like I couldn't break form on some of the essays. And so I really was like, I think, maybe a small press is where it's going to land. And like, I'm good with that. So I started submitting to contests. Santa Fe Writers Group has a annual contest that's great. I made the long list for that with like a kind of shitty early draft. And then I submitted to Trio House Press, again, kind of a rough, not like my first draft, but definitely not quite where it landed. And I was a finalist in that one, and I got a really nice rejection from Chris. And she said she loved it. We don't quite have the bandwidth to like edit right now. But she gave me some ideas, and I was so sad because Trio House Press is based in Minnesota, and it just something about it felt kind of faded. And so I couldn't respond to that email at the time. I was just like, okay, I know this is a positive signal, but it makes me really sad. And so I kept kind of working on the book and alternating between working on the book and being sad about that it wasn't finding its home quite on my timeline. And I went to AWP not this last time in Baltimore, but the time before in LA in 2025. And I was like, okay, I'm ready. I want to go through this booksellers thing. I'm going to take pictures of all the small presses that I could land, and I was thinking about university presses and anybody that I could reach out to on my own. And I was like trying to just strategize how I was going to do this. But my main thing about going through the booksellers was like, I want to say hi to Chris. And I would just want to thank her for sending this rejection. And so she was all the way in the back. I went through, I did my little thing. And P.S. I'd been really like kind of bummed at this AWP because I was just like, I'm not where I want to be. And I'm listening to all these panels and I'm inspired, but I'm also kind of bummed. But so anyway, that's kind of where I'm at emotionally. And I say hi to Chris and she like, I'm like, hi, I'm Courtney. And she instantly knew who I was. And we had like this amazing, it was just like 5 or 10 minutes, but we had this very like, such a friendly conversation. And she was like, we've got a contest coming up. And I'm like, I know, I'm working on a revision now. And she gave me a book and it was just really lovely. And she just kind of felt like an old friend, even though we were just meeting. And 2 weeks later, I got an email from Chris and she was like, I can't stop thinking about Girl Gone Wild. I just looked at I just looked at the draft you sent and I think we can get it there and I could give you a deal on spec. And I was like, don't let me just send you and the revision that I was working on was like, the other one was here and it was like, here it was like significantly better. I had done like a really good developmental edit. And so, then she was like, hell yes, when she got it. And we moved forward from there. And I guess my lessons from that are just like, I could regret submitting it too early. Like if I submitted the next year, like maybe I could have won that contest, but also it didn't matter because like your rejection can turn in, it's my best acceptance yet. And just, I think I would have been shocked if you would have told me how like it all played out back when I got that rejection.
Yeah. I also love the kind rejections. I always tell people like, hello, that is someone taking the time to say they liked your work. And so don't lose sight of those people, circle back. So you did everything right. Good job. That's a great story. So, it's a brave book, Courtney, and I wanted to just like preface this question by saying that I think that you've managed to show how women can be both feminists and self-compromising, like we are. Mm-hmm. How you can love yourself and still make choices that are self-harming and self-betraying. And really, you're like throwing yourself at life, which is the thing I most like about your personality. And, you're also standing firm in your own convictions. And really, I think ultimately standing proud in the face of hard decisions and refusing to blame your younger self. So all of that is to say, like, you're fun to read, you're interesting to listen to. And so I wanted to ask you a question about your podcast specifically so that you could tell our listeners about your podcasts. And because I was a recent guest and you actually know a lot about writing and publishing as well. And then you have the podcast about sex. So if you could just say a little bit about like, where can people find you and what do you love about podcasting?
I mean, it's become part of my job, but like I love it just for the opportunity to connect with people. I think Ira Glass has this thing about like, it's a strange person that really just wants to skip all the small talk and just have these like arranged, super deep conversations with people. But that's how I love it. Like there's nothing better. And so, I will say just as a tip to writers, everything that I did hire PR for Girl Gone Wild, but really like every big thing that I have gotten in this book launch has been because of relationships that I have from my podcast. And everything that I learned about how to even get the book deal is because of conversations that I had on my podcast. And so, you know, you could just start a simple Q&A series for your Substack, but something like that is like a really great way to start connecting with other people, get deeper into the writing community. Blurbs that I have are from people who have been on my podcast. And so it's just such a great way to explore a topic that you're interested in and meet other fellow nerds on your same journey. And so, yeah, I do it for Love and Sexuality on Private Parts Unknown. I do it for book writing and publishing on The Bleeders. And, you know, I'm clearly addicted to podcasting. So I share my podcasting tips on Podcast Bestie, and I love it.
You're talking to a couple podcast addicts right here. Yeah. So in closing, you know, you essentially disclose at the end of the book that your next book is going to be about your eating disorder. And Brooke and I were wondering if this is kind of an accountability strategy or whether that's a work in progress or a seed for a book that you really know you must write.
Well, it's so interesting because the eating disorder, some of the eating disorder stuff, there was some that made it into Girl Gone Wild, but never as like the centerpiece of an essay or chapter. And I pulled all of that out because it just felt like, is it related to feminism? Yes, but it was like one theme too many, and it felt like too much to cover appropriately in the book. And I think that's the right decision, but like I know it's like a little bit of a loose thread in the book. It's just something that's like percolating in the background. And so I felt like it was a good opportunity to tease what is next. It's like halfway written, so it's not like a pipe dream of a book. And I've also found that, you know, my eating disorder stuff is like really entwined with this question of like, do I want to be a mother or not? And so that is like another major theme of the next memoir that I'm working on, and I'm fucking 42. So it's like, I got to figure it out yesterday. So I do have to finish this book soon.
Finish it so that you know what to do.
Yeah.
Oh man. Well, I have someone in my memoir class right now who had an accidental pregnancy at 46. So, you know,
that's great.
It is great. And good luck with all of it, with the writing, with figuring that out, with all the things that you're doing, which is really exciting, and especially with promoting this book. And we hope that our listeners will buy it and read it and gain a lot from it. So thank you, Courtney.
Huge thanks, Courtney.
Thank you so much for all your thoughtful questions. So great.
We'll be right back with today's book trend.
Brooke, I don't know if what we're talking about here is a trend per se, but I do know that anything Lena Dunham touches seems to set conversations and critiques and headlines in motion. So she's kind of like a walking, talking trend machine, you know. And I'm speaking in particular now of her newly released memoir, Fame Sick. And I don't want to put it in the category of celebrity memoir because Lena Dunham is fundamentally a writer. You know, she wrote the groundbreaking show Girls. She was mentored by Nora Ephron, and her character on Girls, Hannah Hervold, is a writer. And in one of the episodes, she says, I think I may be the voice of my generation, or at least a voice of a generation. And it's in that shift from the voice to a voice that's significant for me, because no one is the voice like they used to be generations ago. Yeah, you know, Girls captured something important, and especially for millennials, and particularly for millennial women, just about what it means to become a woman in the city in this complicated world. And I always viewed Girls as a contrast to Sex and the City, because it centered itself on women's friendships and challenges in the big city of New York. But Girls had obviously more of a feminist sensibility, and even though the main characters were quite privileged and quite white, Girls also took on heftier subjects. You know, I'll always admire Lena Dunham for taking on the beauty standard by being nude on screen and having sex with hot men, even though her body didn't fit into the rules of the beauty standard as we've come to know them. And she asserted her own beauty by revealing her body and enjoying it. And she made sure the viewer saw her body and reckoned with it.
Totally. And since we're on the subject of sex and feminism with Courtney today, I do want to note that The Sex and Girls was unlike almost anything on television. And it wasn't meant to be sexy. It was awkward and weird and sometimes painful and a little bit sad, but also totally unapologetic, which I love and appreciate. And, it's funny because Lena Dunham has largely been out of the public view for a decade, but she seems very present, because of how seismic Girls felt when it arrived in 2012. And here was this woman, only in her 20s who was creating, writing, directing, starring in this show, and also like showing her body and showing her messy, uncomfortable sex life. And that was genuinely radical at the time.
Yeah, definitely. And what's interesting about Famesick is that the body conversation continues, but now it's not just about the cultural politics of how her body appeared on screen. It's about what her body was actually going through, while all that was happening. And her illness narrative is central to the book. She visits doctors while doubled over in pain, and she's ignored. And she, became reliant on medications for anxiety and PTSD to the point where she ended up in rehab. And even with good health insurance, the battle to be listened to was arduous. And it's a moment of kind of tragic victory when she undergoes surgery and a doctor removes 37 lesions from her organs and tells her he doesn't know how she'd been able to walk. So the story of a woman's body not being believed, not being taken seriously by the medical establishment, is a different thread that runs through this book.
Yeah, it's a fascinating double narrative. Like publicly, her body was being scrutinized and mocked and debated as this cultural symbol. And then privately, her body was in genuine crisis. And, obviously both things happen simultaneously, which is a reminder that the body is never a body, when it belongs to a woman in public. I think that is just a really important thing to note. And, that everybody feels entitled to it and they talk about it and annotate it and correct it. So I'm glad that Lena Dunham is back with this book.
Per her penchant for making viewers uncomfortable at times, I'd love to talk about the relationship between Hannah and the character Adam Driver played, because it's one of the strangest and perhaps the most honest portrayals of sexual power dynamics that I've seen on television. Adam Sackler, who's the character, he's just genuinely unsettling in those early seasons. He's demanding, he's boundary crossing. The sex is sometimes coercive in ways the show doesn't flinch from showing. And yet Hannah keeps going back, and that disturbed a lot of viewers. But I think that was exactly the point. She was showing female desire as just this genuinely complicated thing. And that sometimes she was drawn to things that, aren't straightforwardly good for you, and she did it in a way without condemning Hannah or romanticizing it, but putting it in the context of like one character's kind of confused search.
It's interesting when you're talking right now, Grant, because I'm just thinking about how that led to her being condemned for oversharing, and that is something really worth interrogating, because it's oftentimes a term that is applied to women. Like when Karl Ove Knausgaard wrote 6 volumes of autobiography, including extraordinarily intimate details about his life and his alcoholism, nobody called it oversharing. They called it brave and boundary dissolving and important. And then you had, Philip Roth, who spent 50 years fictionalizing his own sexuality and romantic life, oftentimes in excruciating detail, and yet he won every prize available. Lena Dunham shows her body on screen and writes candidly about her desire, and then people reach for that word oversharing. And so I think it just is, she has done something really groundbreaking for a long time. And she is like this, we're saying, like these words, messy, unglamorous female desire, which apparently remains more transgressive than anything Knausgaard or Roth, could ever put on the page somehow.
Yeah. Well, Famesick is interesting on this subject because she seems to have, she internalized the criticism, because how could you not? And she writes in a little bit of a different way now. She's more precise and more controlled. But the book still asks this fundamental question: why was my candor a problem when men's candor is considered literature?
Well, there you go, right? Because for a 25-year-old woman, we certainly asked her to represent a lot, to get the politics exactly right, to carry the weight of feminist discourse, so much stuff. And then, the internet treated her like a punching bag, as they often do. And so, like I said, I'm happy that she's out there with this new book, Famesick, and it's getting genuinely good reviews, which is not surprising to me at all. One critic called it a pleasure to consume. Its sentences seductive, its rhythms soothing. So maybe the fame sickness has produced something like wisdom, or maybe something like clarity, which is a lot more than a lot of people get out of being famous at 25. So we'll all check out Lena Dunham's new memoir, Famesick. Thanks for listening, folks. Memoir Nation is a podcast. It's also a community, so please check out both. And if you haven't dropped into our community yet, please do. You can connect with other memoirists. You can share thoughts and ideas, come to a public event, or join us at the membership level and check out our classes and our accountability group. It's all exciting stuff. So thanks, everybody. We'll see you at memoirnation.com.